At 3:11 a.m., under the humming, fluorescent lights of St. Gabriel General Hospital in Houston, Texas, something happened that no security camera would ever record and no administrator would ever understand. But before that moment, before the miracle that would rewrite one woman's entire life, there was only exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't just live in the body, but settles deep in the soul. The emergency room was quiet in the way only a 3 a.m. ER can be. A low, eerie silence filled with the soft beeping of monitors, distant coughing, and the occasional crackle of a radio from EMS down the hall. And somewhere beneath that silence, beneath the antiseptic scent and the cold tile floors, there was a question lingering in the air. A question every nurse has asked at least once in their career. God, are you still here? Nurse Margaret Flores, 54, leaned her back against the hallway wall, sliding down an inch without meaning to. She had been awake for 36 hours straight, pulled through 2 emergency surgeries, a multi-car freeway collision, and more trauma cases than her memory could keep up with. Her legs trembled under her scrubs. Her lower back screamed with every breath. Her hands that had cared for thousands of strangers, shook slightly from fatigue. Her voice cracked as she whispered to no one. Just 3 more hours. 3 more. Her ponytail, once neatly tied, had fallen apart hours ago. Strands of gray and black hair clung to her temples. The dark circles under her eyes looked almost bruised. Sweat and dried tears left faint tracks on her skin. This was not the heroic image people posted on National Nurses Day. This was the truth. The cost. The breaking point. Outside, the Texas rain tapped against the sliding ER doors in a slow, steady rhythm. Inside, Margaret's mind drifted back to everything waiting for her. When the shift ended, her mother's Alzheimer's, the crushing medical bills, the $60,000 surgery she could never afford, the credit cards maxed out just to survive, and the feeling sharp and familiar that she was drowning, not in blood or chaos or emergencies, but in life. She exhaled shakily. That was when it arrived. A sound not loud, not dramatic, just the metallic bang of the ER entrance flinging open as if pushed by the wind. The automatic doors struggled to catch up, and then a single question, harsh and irritated, from the night receptionist. Sir, do you have insurance? Because if not, you're wasting your time. Margaret's eyes opened. A silhouette stood at the entrance, swaying, dripping rainwater, barefoot. And then the hook that would change everything. A voice soft, trembling, barely audible. Please, somebody help me. Most people in that moment saw a homeless man, a burden, a problem. But if you look closely at what unfolded next, if you listen carefully to every word spoken in that hallway, you will understand why, years later, some people still whisper that Jesus Christ himself walked into a Houston emergency room on a rain-soaked September night, and only one exhausted nurse recognized him. Long before the rain-soaked man staggered into St. Gabriel's ER, life had already been pressing Margaret Flores to the edge of collapse. What the hospital staff saw, a tired nurse with kind eyes and shaking hands, was only the visible fraction of a much heavier story. Those who knew her well, especially the older nurses who had watched her survive heartbreak after heartbreak, whispered the same sentence behind closed doors. She carries too much for one person, and they weren't wrong. 8 years earlier, on an ordinary Wednesday morning, her husband Robert Flores collapsed in the kitchen while reaching for a cup of coffee. A massive heart attack. No warning, no last words. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. And just like that, the house that had once been filled with laughter and slow dances and family dinners fell into a silence Margaret still hadn't fully recovered from. Her children, Daniel, then 23, and Rebecca, 21, grieved in their own ways. But grief hits adult children differently. Within 2 years, both had moved away, chasing jobs in distant states. They called, they texted, they meant well, but they built new lives, and Margaret felt their absence more sharply each holiday season. The empty chairs at Thanksgiving seemed to echo louder every year. Then came the phone call that reshaped everything. Her mother, Dolores, had Alzheimer's. The diagnosis hit harder than any death, because this loss would be slow, cruel. Month by month, Dolores forgot recipes she had once made by heart. Then she forgot which room was hers. Then she began forgetting Margaret's name, though never the sound of her voice, which seemed to calm her even when she could no longer place who was speaking. The disease advanced quickly. Eventually, Margaret had to hire a part-time caregiver. Insurance covered some, but not enough. Bills piled up. Medical equipment, medications, doctor visits, a specialized neurologist, transportation, home modifications. Even with double shifts, even with cutting every expense she could, the math never worked. And soon, the whispers came soft at first, then relentless. Past due. Minimum payment required. Your balance is over the limit. Collections department calling. Her credit score plunged. Her savings disappeared. Her house slipped dangerously close to foreclosure. Then the neurologist delivered the final blow. A blood clot had formed deep in Dolores's brain. Surgery was urgent. Without it, she could suffer a massive stroke. But the cost, $60,000, was unreachable. Not in this economy. Not for a night shift nurse, living one broken paycheck away from disaster. Some nights, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table, papers spread like battlefield ruins around her, whispering to the quiet house, "I'm trying, God. I'm trying so hard." She wasn't angry, she was tired. A kind of tired that seeps into the bones. A tired that makes hope feel like a luxury. And yet, every night, she put on her scrubs, tied her hair back, kissed her mother on the forehead, and walked into Street Gabriel's ER, as if she weren't carrying a lifetime of falling dominoes on her shoulders. That was the woman who stood in the hallway when the uninsured man stumbled through the doors. A woman already drowning, already broken, already on her knees. Yet moments away from encountering the one presence who knew every single piece of her story, Jesus Christ, still disguised in rain and exhaustion, had stepped into her shift. And nothing in her life would remain the same. Just minutes before the uninsured stranger pushed through the ER doors, the emergency department at Street Gabriel General had been drowning in chaos. At 2:18 a.m., paramedics radioed in. Multi-vehicle rollover on I-45. 2 critical, 1 unstable. For nurses who had worked long enough in Houston's night shifts, those words were never just a call. They were a summons, the kind that flips survival mode on like a switch. And for Nurse Margaret Flores, running purely on instinct after 36 sleepless hours, the switch clicked the moment the crash cart rolled out of the trauma bay. The ambulance doors flew open first, carrying a young woman whose screams cut through the hallway like tearing metal. Her legs were twisted unnaturally, one femur possibly fractured, and blood soaked through the paramedics' blankets faster than they could replace them. "BP dropping. She's crashing. Move, move, move. Get me a second bag of Oneg. Margaret, I need hands, now." There was no time to think. No time to feel. Only motion. Dr. James Thompson, calm but sharp as a blade, called out orders that Margaret executed before he finished speaking them. She clamped lines, suctioned blood, adjusted monitors, braced shattered limbs, and pressed gauze to a chest wound that refused to stop pouring red. Her gloves were slick, warm, and heavy. The kind of sensation nurses never truly forget. The trauma bay became a world of its own. Machines blaring, paramedics shouting vitals, Thompson barking commands, and Margaret, silent yet unwavering, anchoring the entire storm. When the woman's heart rate finally stabilized and her breaths evened out, a wave of exhaustion hit the room so hard that even Dr. Thompson paused to exhale. The team stepped back. Bloody gloves slapped into biohazard bins. Boots scraped across the floor. Someone whispered, "Good save, everyone." But even victories have a cost, especially at 3 a.m. Margaret staggered into the hallway, peeled off her gloves, and pressed trembling hands to her lower back. Her scrubs clung to her with sweat. A faint tremor ran through her arms from muscle fatigue. Her body begged, no, pleaded, for 5 minutes of stillness. She checked the clock. 3:12 a.m. Just 3 more hours, she whispered. Her break, if she could even call it that, lasted less than 60 seconds, because the universe, the one she wasn't sure believed in her anymore, had one more interruption waiting. A sharp metallic crash echoed through the ER entrance. The automatic doors jerked violently as though battered by the storm outside. Margaret's eyes lifted. The nurses at the station froze. Even Dr. Thompson looked up from his chart. There, framed by the spill of rain and fluorescent light, stood a soaking wet figure, swaying on bare feet, clutching blood-soaked rags around his hands. His face was bruised, his hair tangled with leaves and road dirt, and water dripped steadily from his hoodie onto the polished floor. And then came the line that would sever Margaret's last thread of rest. "Sir, unless you have insurance, we can't treat you," the receptionist snapped. Margaret closed her eyes, not in frustration, but in something closer to heartbreak, because she knew this moment, this script, this cruelty. Even before she turned toward him, even before she walked those 3 heavy steps, something in her chest tightened with a strange, ancient familiarity. Her break was over, and destiny had just walked into the room. The ER doors hissed closed behind the drenched stranger, trapping a thin trail of rainwater across the tile, like a signature of someone who didn't belong in a place built on paperwork and policies. He stood there trembling, not violently, just enough that anyone paying attention could see the pain radiating through his body. Most people looked away. Margaret Flores did not. He was barefoot, toes purple from cold, leaving faint red prints each time he shifted his weight. His jeans were torn at the knee, soaked to the bone, mud clinging to the hem. The hoodie he wore, once white perhaps, was now a mottled blend of gray and dirt, stretched thin across a chest rising and falling with effort. But it was his hands that froze Margaret in place. Layers of filthy cloth were wrapped around them, taped together poorly, with fresh blood seeping through every crease. The cloths were so saturated they dripped rhythmically onto the floor. And yet, his eyes were gentle. Not frightened, not angry, just unbearably tired. "Sir," the night receptionist snapped, leaning over the counter with visible irritation. "I asked you already. Do you have insurance or not?" The man swallowed, wincing as though even that movement caused pain. I don't," he whispered, "but I've been turned away everywhere else. I just need someone to clean my wounds, please." Yolanda Perez, a woman whose patience had eroded long before this shift began, scoffed loudly enough for the entire waiting area to hear. "This is an ER, not a shelter. No insurance, no treatment. You're bleeding all over my floor. Either get coverage or get out before I call security." A few patients looked away in discomfort. One man shook his head, another muttered, "Poor guy," but didn't move. Margaret took a step forward. She'd seen men like him before, lonely, cold, ignored by a system built for those with the right cards in their wallets. But something was different tonight. Something in the way he stood, shoulders slumped yet dignified, as if he had endured far worse rejections than this sterile lobby. "Please," he said again, voice cracking. "My hands, they hurt so much. I can't stop the bleeding." He lifted one hand slightly. The movement sent a single bead of red sliding down his wrist. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Yolanda stood abruptly, pointing toward the exit. "That's it. You're done here. Leave before you make a mess of the whole." "Stop." The word cut through the air like a scalpel. It came from Margaret. Every nurse on the night shift recognized that tone. The tone of a woman who had finally decided she'd seen enough suffering for one lifetime. Yolanda blinked. "Margaret, don't you start. You know the policy." "I know the policy," she replied, stepping closer to the man. "And I also know he's a human being standing in front of us bleeding." She turned her eyes toward Yolanda, unflinching. "We're not throwing him into the storm." The man's shoulders sagged, not in defeat but in relief so fragile it could shatter at the slightest resistance. "I'll take him," Margaret said quietly. "Come with me, sir." Yolanda's face reddened. "Margaret, you'll get yourself fired? Then I'll get fired." The hallway fell silent. The man met Margaret's eyes with gratitude so raw, so full of aching humanity, it didn't feel like gratitude at all. It felt like recognition. As if somewhere, somehow, he had known she would choose compassion over rules. And as Margaret guided him away from the counter toward a small exam room at the end of the hall, no one in the ER realized they were witnessing the beginning of something divine. They only saw a tired nurse helping a bleeding stranger. But heaven saw much more. As Margaret guided the injured stranger down the dim corridor, the tremor in her hands wasn't only from exhaustion anymore. It was from the weight of the decision she had just made. A decision every nurse in America understands too well. The moment when policy collides head-on with humanity. Behind her, Yolanda muttered into the phone, likely already reporting the violation to administration. A couple of nurses peeked around the corner, wide-eyed, whispering among themselves. "Flores is going to get written up. She knows better. She could lose her license for this." But Margaret didn't hear them. Or maybe she did, and simply no longer cared. Inside exam room 7, the man hesitated at the doorway, as if unsure he was allowed to cross it. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're safe in here." He stepped inside with slow, deliberate movements. His wet footprints followed him like a trail of sorrow across the sterile tile. Margaret closed the door gently, shutting out the fluorescent buzz of the hospital politics just beyond it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Have a seat on the exam table. I'm going to take a look at your hands." The man complied, lowering himself onto the edge of the table with a grace that seemed strangely out of place for someone in such pain. His hoodie clung to him, dripping onto the floor, forming a small, darkened puddle. As she moved around him, rolling a stool closer, a dozen thoughts fired through her mind. If admin checks the cameras, I'm done. If they look at supply logs, I'm done. If they decide to make an example out of me, I'm done. But then another thought slipped through quiet. Simple, undeniable. What if I don't help him? What does that make me? Margaret had spent 30 years trying to be the kind of nurse her mother raised her to be. The kind who didn't need applause to do the right thing. But the system had a way of wearing people down, convincing them that compassion was a luxury they couldn't afford. Tonight, however, something inside her refused to stay silent. She reached for scissors and began cutting through the soaked, filthy cloth around his hands. Each layer peeled away revealed more damage, deeper bruising, swelling, and the unmistakable puncture-like wounds in the center of both palms. She tried to hide the sharp inhale that escaped her, but the man noticed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "This must hurt terribly." He shook his head gently. "I've known worse." There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just a calm acceptance that felt almost ancient. Margaret swallowed hard. "Sir, I could get in serious trouble for treating you without insurance, but I won't turn away someone who's hurting. Not tonight, not ever again." The man looked at her, then truly looked. His eyes held a softness that made her chest tighten, as if he were seeing more than just her face. Perhaps her struggle, her grief, her long nights of doubt. "You're doing what you were made to do," he whispered. "Even when it costs you." Her throat tightened. "Maybe. But sometimes it feels like the world punishes people who still care." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched like a held breath. "Compassion is never a mistake, Margaret, even when the world forgets it." Before she could respond, the overhead intercom crackled outside the door, calling another code, another crisis, another reminder that the system demanded speed, not kindness. But for once, Margaret didn't rush. For the first time in years, she had chosen her conscience over the rules. And heaven was watching. Inside exam room 7, the hum of the overhead light filled the silence as Margaret rolled closer on her stool. The stainless steel tray beside her lined with saline, gauze, and antiseptic. The man sat quietly on the exam table, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting in his lap like fragile relics wrapped in dirty cloth. "All right," she murmured, steadying herself. "Let's see what we're dealing with." He lifted his hands slowly, too slowly for someone merely injured. The movement looked practiced, familiar, as if he were used to carrying pain the way others carry breath. Margaret began cutting carefully through the last of the fabric. The cloth fell away, and for a heartbeat, she forgot to breathe. What she saw wasn't the chaotic shredding of a construction accident, nor the jagged tearing of a street fight. These wounds were precise, clean-edged, round, deep, a vertical puncture through the center of the palm, through muscle, through tissue, yet somehow not fresh, not old, sitting in a strange place between the two, as though they'd been inflicted intentionally, as though the flesh had been pierced straight through. Her throat tightened. Good Lord, the man didn't flinch. He simply watched her with calm, steady eyes. "Who did this to you?" she asked quietly, more shaken than she meant to sound. This wasn't an accident. He tilted his head, as if searching for the simplest way to explain something unbearably complicated. "Some people still don't accept who I am," he said softly. Margaret froze, not at the words, but at the tone. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was sorrowful, like someone describing an old wound inflicted long before this night. Before she could respond, he spoke again. "And when they fear what they do not understand, they hurt my hands." The phrasing struck her like a cold wind. "My hands, not my hands." My hands. Capital M. A strange echo of something ancient. Something she couldn't name. She refocused, swallowing hard. These wounds, they go right through the palm. I've never seen anything like this outside of medical textbooks. He smiled softly. Not triumphant, not eerie, just deeply gentle. You've seen more suffering than most, Margaret. You know that pain can tell a story. She dabbed saline gently across the puncture, and the man exhaled but did not pull away. No hiss of pain, no recoil, just endurance that felt almost unnatural. You should be screaming, she whispered. This should hurt like hell. It did, he replied. A long time ago. Margaret paused. Something about the way he said it, like someone remembering a distant execution rather than an injury from this week or month. I don't understand, she said, voice trembling. You will, he answered simply. A silence settled over the room, heavy, reverent, like the air just before a revelation. Margaret cleaned and dressed the wounds slowly, methodically, her hands moving on instinct even as her mind spiraled. The precision, the depth, the symmetry. They looked like… No, that couldn't be. But the thought pressed in anyway, unwelcome and undeniable. They looked like the wounds depicted in every crucifix she had ever passed in a church hallway. When she finished, he lifted his now bandaged hands, studying them as though revisiting an old chapter of his own story. You did well, he said quietly. You have gentle hands. Margaret's voice cracked. So do you. He looked up, eyes warm, ancient, impossibly knowing. Not always, he whispered. And in that moment, without a flash of light or a shiver of air, something in Margaret's heart began shifting just slightly but irrevocably, as if she were beginning to understand who truly sat before her. When the last bandage was secured around his wounded palm, Margaret finally exhaled, a long, shaky release she'd been holding since the moment she began treating him. The man sat quietly on the exam table, his posture neither demanding nor defeated. Just present. Just waiting. But waiting for what? She couldn't tell. Her stomach growled then, loud enough to embarrass her. 36 hours. No real food. A single cup of vending machine coffee. Half a protein bar she barely remembered eating. Oh, she muttered, placing a hand over her abdomen. I'm sorry. He shook his head gently. You don't need to apologize for being human. Something about the way he said it, soft, warm, as if he were giving her permission to exist, sent a sting of tears behind her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. Inside her locker in the break room, she knew there was one thing left. A small plastic lunchbox she'd packed the previous morning. A ham and cheese sandwich, a red apple, and a plastic bottle of water. It wasn't much, and after sitting for more than a day, it wasn't fresh. But it was supposed to be her dinner, or breakfast, or whatever meal it was, at this point in her endless shift. And yet the moment she thought of that lunchbox, she also thought of the man before her, barefoot, soaked, trembling, clearly hungry. Have you eaten? She asked quietly. He looked down at his hands as if trying to remember. Not for a while. That answer, simple, uncomplaining, cut deeper than anything he'd said before. Margaret hesitated only a second before standing. Wait here. She hurried to the break room, feeling the weight of exhaustion in every step. She opened her locker, grabbed the lunchbox, and held it for a moment. Her fingers tightened around the cheap plastic. This was supposed to carry her through the last brutal hours of her shift. But something, call it instinct, conscience, or something more divine, told her she wouldn't be the one eating tonight. When she returned, the man hadn't moved. He sat like a figure carved from silence, his eyes lifting to her with a softness that made her chest ache. She set the lunchbox in front of him and unlatched it. Here, she said. It's not much, but it's yours. He looked at the food, then at her, as if weighing more than hunger. Are you sure? He asked. You look like you need this more than I do. She forced a smile. I'll be fine. But she wouldn't be. She knew that. And somehow he seemed to know it too. Still, he didn't argue. Instead, he lifted the sandwich with careful bandaged hands and took a slow bite. Not the desperate gulp of a starving man, but the thoughtful savoring of someone tasting something meaningful. As he ate, Margaret watched him, and an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. A strange peace, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. This is very kind of you, he said softly between bites. You gave what you needed. Her eyes lowered. It's just a sandwich. No, he replied, his voice touching the air like a blessing. It's generosity. And generosity from someone who is hurting is the rarest gift of all. The words struck something deep inside her, an old, forgotten part of herself. A part that still believed compassion mattered, that small acts still held power. She didn't know why her simple meal felt sacred in his hands, but heaven knew. And soon, she would too. When the man finished the last bite of the sandwich, he closed the lunchbox gently, almost reverently, as though she had handed him far more than a day-old meal. Margaret felt something shift in the room, subtle at first, like the air had thickened, like time itself had paused to listen. He looked up at her, not casually, not gratefully, but knowingly, as if he saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one had in years. You've carried so much, Margaret, he said quietly, more than most hearts could bear. She swallowed hard. Something inside her braced, as if preparing for news she didn't want to hear. You've been walking through life alone for a long time, he continued, fighting battles no one else sees, worrying about things you can't control, trying to save everyone but yourself. Her breath caught. The room felt too small. Her scrub top suddenly too tight across her ribs. How do you know that? She whispered. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he shifted forward, his bandaged hands resting lightly on his knees. Your mother will be healed. Margaret blinked. What? The clot, the confusion, the slipping away piece by piece. It won't end the way you fear. The suffering you've watched for years, he paused, his eyes softening. Tomorrow, that chapter begins to close. Her pulse hammered. Hope something she had buried deep rose too quickly, too painfully. No, she said, shaking her head. That's impossible. Her doctor said. He raised a hand gently, stopping her. Let tomorrow speak for itself. She stared at him, trembling. Who are you? But he continued, his voice steady, filled with an authority not loud but absolute. Your debts will be lifted from you, not by your strength, not by your effort, but by grace. Margaret's hands went cold. She had spent nights crying over bills she couldn't pay, afternoons pleading with banks, early mornings trying to perform impossible math. Now a stranger was telling her the one thing she had stopped allowing herself to imagine. Freedom. And you, he added softly, will rest. Truly rest. For the first time in many years, her throat tightened painfully. Why are you saying these things to me? She whispered. What do you want from me? At this, the man smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just a faint curve of the lips filled with warmth so deep it seemed to settle into the floor, the walls, her bones. I want nothing from you, he said gently. This is a gift, for kindness freely given. She felt the sting of tears. I only did what anyone would do. He shook his head. No, not everyone chooses compassion when it costs them. But you did, and heaven noticed. For a moment, silence enveloped them again, thick, reverent, holy. Then he spoke the words that would echo in her mind long after he disappeared into the night. Tomorrow, everything changes. Not said like a prediction. Said like a promise carved into eternity. Margaret's breath trembled. Please, she whispered again. Tell me who you are. He slipped off the exam table, standing slowly, the overhead light catching the faint shimmer of dried rain on his hair. You'll understand soon. And though no miracle burst forth in that dim hospital room, something far greater did. A certainty, quiet, undeniable, that the impossible was already in motion. When Margaret arrived home, after her shift ended at 4:39 a.m., she collapsed into bed with the man's final words echoing in her mind. Tomorrow, everything changes. She didn't believe it. She wanted to, but belief felt dangerous. She slept for only a few hours before her phone jolted her awake, an unfamiliar number on the screen. The voice on the other end was clipped. Official. Miss Flores, this is the administrative office at Street Gabriel General. The director needs to see you immediately. Her stomach dropped. Yolanda must have reported her. They were going to fire her. By the time she stepped off the bus and walked through the glass doors of the administrative wing, her palms were damp with dread. The director, Linda Harrington, sat behind a polished mahogany desk, an elegant woman in her early 60s, with silver hair, sharp glasses, and a reputation for running the hospital like a court of law. Take a seat, Nurse Flores. Margaret sat, bracing for the blow. Harrington slid a file across the desk. We received a report last night that you treated a patient without insurance. Margaret nodded slowly. It's true. He was bleeding. I made the call. She waited for the reprimand for termination papers, for the humiliation she worried she wouldn't survive. But instead, Harrington's expression shifted, almost to confusion. That's not why you're here, she said softly. Something unusual happened this morning, and your name came up. She opened another folder. At 7:02 a.m., the hospital received a wire transfer from a private law firm in Houston. The funds are designated for you. Margaret blinked. For me? Correct. Harrington turned the document toward her. $60,000. Exactly the amount needed for her mother's surgery. Margaret's breath caught. Director, this must be a mistake. There's more, Harrington continued, adjusting her glasses. Another transfer followed 15 minutes later. This one was sent directly to your creditors. She slid 3 bank confirmations across the desk. All your medical debt, your credit lines, your overdue balances, paid off in full. It felt like the room shifted sideways. Her vision blurred as if underwater. She whispered, trembling, "Who did this?" The donor insisted on anonymity, Harrington said. The law firm won't disclose a name. Silence crept through the room. But the director wasn't done. There's something else, she said carefully. I reviewed the security footage from last night. Margaret's pulse quickened. This was it. The proof she broke protocol. Harrington turned her monitor around. The footage played. Margaret watched herself walk to the ER reception desk. Talking, gesturing, calling someone to follow her, but the space beside her was empty. She watched herself lead someone down the hall, but in the footage, she was alone. She watched herself open the exam room door, step inside, close it, alone. Her blood ran cold. Director, he was right there, Margaret said, voice cracking. The man I treated, why isn't he? There is no entry in the patient logs, Harrington said gently. No intake form, no ID, no vitals recorded. According to our system, no such patient exists. Margaret shook her head violently. I cleaned his wounds. I bandaged him. I fed him. I believe you, Harrington said quietly. But something inexplicable occurred in this hospital last night. She leaned forward. Whoever or whatever that man was, he wanted you to be free. Margaret felt tears spill over. Not from fear, not from confusion. From recognition, because now she understood the meaning of his words. Tomorrow, everything changes. And tomorrow had already come. The neurologist's waiting room at Houston Methodist Hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and old magazines, an aroma Margaret had come to associate with fear. She sat stiffly in a plastic chair while her mother, Dolores, rested in a wheelchair beside her, blinking slowly, drifting in and out of a fog that had become her prison. The surgery to remove the blood clot had ended an hour earlier. The doctor had called it successful. But Margaret knew the truth. Success didn't guarantee clarity. Alzheimer's was a thief, and it rarely returned what it stole. While they waited for Dolores to wake fully, Dr. Elias Monroe, a soft-spoken neurologist known for both brilliance and honesty, entered the room holding a tablet of scans. Miss Flores, he began, may I speak with you privately? Her stomach tightened. Private never meant good news. They stepped into a small consultation room. Dr. Monroe locked the wheels of his stool and sat across from her, his expression strangely thoughtful. I've been reviewing your mother's imaging, he said. Before and after the procedure. Margaret braced. Please just tell me the truth. He rotated the screen toward her. This, he said pointing, is the scan from last month. The patterns were heartbreaking but familiar. Shrunken temporal lobes, plaque accumulation, the blurred roadmap of deteriorating memory. And this, he continued, switching images, is your mother's brain today. Margaret squinted, confused. The structures looked full, healthy, clear. This can't be right, she whispered. Dr. Monroe exhaled slowly. That's exactly what I said. He pulled up the medical timeline. The blood clot is gone, completely. That part is expected after surgery. But the Alzheimer's markers, the plaque, the tangles, the cortical thinning, are missing. Not reduced, not slowed. Missing? Margaret stared at him. That's impossible. Medically speaking? Yes. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. But the images don't lie. She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. What are you saying, doctor? I'm saying, he hesitated, choosing words as carefully as a surgeon choosing instruments. Your mother's brain looks like that of a woman who never had Alzheimer's. A ringing filled Margaret's ears. Not fear. Not disbelief. Recognition. The stranger's voice echoed through her mind. Your mother will be healed. A knock interrupted their silence. A nurse poked her head in. Doctor? She's awake. They returned to the recovery room. Dolores sat upright now, eyes alert, not wandering, not searching. Alert. She looked at the doctor first, then slowly turned to her daughter. Her expression softened, eyes filling with clarity that shouldn't have been possible. Maggie? She whispered. Sweetheart, why are you crying? Margaret crumpled to her knees beside the bed. Her mother recognized her, not as a stranger, not as her deceased sister, not as a memory misplaced, as her daughter. Dolores brushed tears from Margaret's cheeks with fingers steady and warm. It's all right, mi niña, she murmured. I'm here. I remember. Dr. Monroe watched silently, his scientific mind scrambling for explanations that didn't exist. Finally, he spoke barely above a whisper. In 30 years of neurology, I've never seen anything like this. Margaret took her mother's hands in hers, the truth settling into her heart with a weight almost too sacred to bear. This wasn't medicine. This was mercy. This was intervention. This was the impossible made real. This was Jesus Christ keeping his promise. In the weeks following Dolores's miraculous recovery, something inside Nurse Margaret Flores shifted. Not suddenly, not loudly, but steadily, like dawn rising behind a skyline. She returned to Street, Gabriel General Hospital, different from the woman who had worked those brutal 36 hours, softer in some ways, stronger in others, and unmistakably certain of one thing: no one who walked into her ER would ever be turned away again. It began quietly. One rainy night, a teenage boy with a broken wrist came in, shaking because he didn't have insurance. While the receptionist hesitated, scanning the payment policy screen on her computer, Margaret stepped forward. I'll take M, she said. No drama. No speech. Just a choice. A week later, a woman fleeing domestic violence arrived with a swollen jaw and no documentation of any kind. Margaret walked her into exam room for herself. The staff began noticing a pattern. Every uninsured case found its way to Margaret's care. Every rejection instinctively triggered her presence. Every moment of hesitation from a colleague was met with her calm but unyielding voice. We treat first. We worry about forms later. It didn't take long for word to spread through whispers in the waiting room, chatter among EMTs, and eventually through Houston's homeless community. Go to Street Gabriel's at night, people said. The nurse with the kind eyes won't turn you away. But the impact wasn't just emotional. It became structural. As part of her unexpected promotion to night shift nursing supervisor, Margaret suddenly found herself with new authority. The power to adjust policy, reassign staff, and set the tone for the entire overnight ER. She began implementing a philosophy modeled not on medical regulations, but on the stranger she had fed in exam room 7. Compassion without conditions, care without prerequisites, worth without paperwork. Some staff resisted. Some murmured behind her back. Some warned her she was being naive. But even they softened over time, not because of her words, but because of what began happening around them. A statistic the hospital tracked quietly began to change. 30% reduction in untreated complications among uninsured patients. Then another. A measurable drop in repeat ER visits due to early intervention. Then another. Houston's mayor publicly acknowledged. Street, Gabriel General for Human-Centered Emergency Care. No one knew the real story. The rain-soaked man, the punctured palms, the prophecy spoken in a whisper. Tomorrow, everything changes. But Margaret knew, and somehow, her staff sensed it too. One night during shift report, a young nurse named Elena spoke up. Margaret, patients look different when you talk to them. Like someone finally sees them. Margaret smiled softly. I see what they are, not what they can pay. The room fell quiet. Even Dr. Thompson, never one for sentiment, cleared his throat before saying, You taught us something the textbooks never did. People come here hurting long before they walk through the door. Margaret lowered her gaze, humbled. "I didn't teach you," she whispered. "I was taught." Years later, hospital administrators would refer to her tenure as the compassion era. They would say Street Gabriel's transformation started with a new policy, a new supervisor, a new philosophy. But those who had been there, those who had watched Margaret lift the forgotten, the uninsured, the afraid, knew the truth. It started with one exhausted nurse choosing mercy over rules. And it grew because heaven honored that decision. By winter, a sign appeared above the ER intake desk, modest, printed on simple white laminate, but carrying the full weight of her legacy. No one turned away. Night shift policy. Patients stared at it. Some cried. Some prayed. Some whispered finally. But Margaret never took credit. Each night as she walked past the sign, she touched it lightly with her fingertips and whispered a quiet acknowledgement. You kept your promise. And somewhere in eternity, or in a place closer than breath, the one who made that promise smiled. In early February, nearly 5 months after that unforgettable night, Margaret returned home after another quiet shift. The kind of peaceful night the ER rarely offered. She hung her scrubs over the bathroom door, made tea she was too tired to drink, and walked into the living room, where a small wooden horse sat on the highest shelf. The same carved horse she had found in exam room 7, the one no one could trace. The one experts said looked first-century Mediterranean. She took it gently into her hands. Even after months of holding it, studying it, wondering about it, she still felt the same strange tenderness radiating from the carved grain, like it carried a story older than her own. Her mother, fully restored and more vibrant than she had been in years, stepped into the room. "Still looking at that little horse?" Dolores teased. Margaret smiled. "I don't know why it means so much." Her mother sat beside her, touching the wooden figure lightly. "Maybe it's not the horse," she said softly. "Maybe it's the one who left it for you." Margaret's breath faltered. She had never told anyone, not even her mother, the full truth, the wounds shaped like nails, the way he spoke about suffering, the way he knew her name, the way her debts vanished, the way the cameras showed no one beside her, and the prophecy. Tomorrow, everything changes. Dolores looked at her daughter the way only a mother can, as though she could see the secrets held behind the eyes. "Maggie," she asked carefully, "do you believe he was who I think he was?" Margaret didn't speak at first. Her fingers ran over the carved mane of the wooden horse. Her heart beat heavy, slow, reverent. Then she whispered, "I don't think he was an angel." "Mom," she swallowed. "He didn't feel like an angel." Her mother leaned in, breath stilling. "Then who?" Margaret's voice trembled like a candle's last flicker before burning brighter. "When I looked into his eyes, it felt like every hurt I ever carried, he had carried first. Every burden I ever lifted, he lifted with me. It was like he understood suffering from the inside, not as a witness, as the one who lived it." A tear slipped down her cheek. "And when he spoke of mercy, it didn't sound like a message. It sounded like memory." She set the wooden horse back onto the shelf, stepping away as though she were stepping back from holy ground. "I think," she said, her voice barely audible, "that I cared for Jesus Christ that night, and he cared for me in return." Dolores covered her mouth as a wave of awe washed over her. The room grew, impossibly still, not empty, full of presence, full of truth. And in that silence, something clicked inside Margaret, the missing piece, the final understanding. Jesus had come, not in radiance or thunder or robes of light, but in rain-soaked clothes, with wounded hands, hungry and alone. He had come the way he always had, as the least of these, not to test her, not to frighten her, but to remind her that heaven still walks into hospitals, into break rooms, into exhausted hearts, disguised as the one we're most tempted to overlook. The next morning, Margaret added a plaque beneath a wooden horse on her shelf, engraved with 3 simple words. "I saw him," and she meant every syllable. Because some miracles don't require lightning. Some revelations don't demand visions. Some encounters don't need proof. Some at times Jesus appears in a place where mercy is needed most, and waits to see who will recognize him. Before we end, the narrator's voice turns outward toward you, the viewer, the listener, the one whose heart has walked this journey with Margaret. Have you ever helped a stranger, only to feel like the encounter meant more than it seemed? Have you ever wondered whether God placed someone in your path not to test you, but to bless you? If this story touched your heart, if it stirred something deep within your spirit, then let this be your invitation. Choose compassion. Choose mercy. Choose to see Christ in the ones the world rejects. And if you want more stories like this, stories of grace, hope, supernatural mercy, and modern miracles, then don't forget, like this video, subscribe to Stories of Grace, and join thousands of others who believe that Jesus still walks among us, often when we least expect it. Because the next miracle might arrive in your life the same way it arrived in hers, quietly, humbly, with wounded hands.